But it really is an honor and a pleasure to be here. Um, it's not the first time that I speak to teachers through Humanities Texas, but it is the first time that I chose to do something kind of out of the ordinary. It's not the usual Sandra Cisneros, Tomás Rivera kind of content. So I'm going off out on a limb. My agenda for today, I want to introduce a historical overview of Latinx literature. I take it all the way back to the Aztecs, and then creative nonfiction as a genre. And then the idea of nonfiction and creative nonfiction in Latinx literature, introducing you to some authors, some of them I'm sure you already know, and then talk about the memoirist and creative nonfiction Chicanx authors. The essays that I sent you to read, if you had a chance to do that, kind of did that. And then we'll do an exercise and then eventually go out into the breakout rooms and come back together. So let's begin. History in the Americas. The literature that I'm talking about is nonfiction, but in the early conception of literature, it was everything. It was poetry, it was narrative, it was oral tradition. And so it includes all of those things. The two poets, and for some reason my animations are not working because they were not supposed to all come out at the same time. The first one is a poet, Nezahualcóyotl, the king of Texcoco, who was a poet. And as you can see, died before the Europeans ever got here. And the other is a woman that I call the first feminist of the Americas. She was a poet, and Macuilchochitzin was writing poems about being out on the battlefield with the warriors. And not only that, she's writing about women being there and having a role, having agency. That's why I call her the first poet. The image that you see is of Nezahualcóyotl. He was a hungry coyote, if you want to translate his name, or fasting coyote is another name for him. And that's why the coyote is over here. That's his name. And then I talk a little bit about the pre-conquest, and they were the two that I highlighted. But in 1325, when the Aztecs arrive in Tenochtitlan and take control of that whole area, people have been there for many, many centuries before the Olmec group. In fact, I was just teaching my folklore class and we were looking at music. The oldest instruments found on this continent are from that era, about 1500 before the Christian era that the Olmecs had. And we have some evidence with codices and things like that. But in 1325, there's a major change point. That's when the Aztecs take control and change some of those things. The oral tradition, of course, includes poetry, like I said earlier, and they had these contests, Floricanto, where they would recite the poetry, and the literature was also a prayer. It's a beautiful prayer song for planting corn. So it was utilitarian, it was functional, as well as beautiful. And Macuilchochitzin that I just mentioned to you is one of the songs, and then Nezahualcóyotl. So another figure in this early literature, although she did not herself write anything, she was the object of a lot of stories during the colonial era and since, is Malinali, or Malintzin, or La Malinche. She was a translator. So in my view, she was a scholar. She was also doing literary work, as it were, as a scholar, functioning as an interpreter from the different tribes to the Spanish. She has been much maligned, and in our literature and Chicana literature, we have recovered her memory and written about her as a hero and not necessarily as the betrayer. In Mexico, one of the worst insults you can receive is to be called a Malinche. And people say that of women who are in the US who have, quote, betrayed Mexico. And they call them Malinchistas. It's also an adjective for anybody who does things that are not truly Mexican. So her name was pretty bad until the Chicanas came along and the poets and the writers kind of revived her and placed her, I think, in the pedestal she deserves as being a savior instead of a betrayer. And the reason I say that is that when you are a translator, she becomes the facilitator for those two worlds that are clashing. Who knows how much more damage would have been done had she not been there. She is all over this lienzo de Tlaxcala that was created in 1552. And you can see her in here, right in this panel right here, next to Cortés, translating. And she's on several panels. The lienzo de Tlaxcala is cotton sheet, approximately 2 meters by 5 meters long. It's pretty big. I had the fortune of being in Mexico City a few years ago when they had a codex exhibit at the Museo Nacional de Antropología, the National Anthropology Museum, and I got to see the lienzo de Tlaxcala. I got all emotional watching it. You know what was really sad? The signage did not even acknowledge Malinche. And she was right there. I could see her, but nothing in any of the literature that they gave us had her name on it. The other one that was during the colonial period, really important, is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And I'm going to show you a very short TEDx video. If I can get this to work. I'm gonna have to stop that share and share here. Okay, wasn't that amazing? I wanted to share that with you because I had talked about the first feminist. Now you heard on there that Sor Juana was considered the first feminist. Well, she was the first published feminist, let's put it that way. But she also was pretty influential for Chicanas writing today. There's several novels by Chicanas about her, poems galore, and Alicia Gaspar de Alba is one of them. But she also wrote nonfiction. She wrote essays. You saw that letter got her in trouble. The poem "Foolish Man," if you don't know it, it's widely available on the internet and in translation and in Spanish. Hombres Necios, and I think it is pretty feminist. Also, I wanted to go through these historical change points after the colonial period. 1810 is the independence, the War of Independence from Spain. Mexico declares its independence. 1848 is the year of the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ends the war between Mexico and the United States. It's a key date for Chicano and Chicana literature, obviously, but also in Mexican history. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution breaks out. And it's another one of those change points because we get many, many intellectuals, as well as just working class folks fleeing the violence of the revolution, coming into the United States. To, of course, the people that were already here in 1848, which was all of the states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado, and points north. If you remember, the boundary in 1848 for the United States was the Louisiana Purchase had been the last one. So it was right there. And then it becomes this huge coast to coast country. In 1965, the major, I missed 1945, but that was also a pretty major change point because many soldiers who had gone to World War II came back and were able to go to college under the GI Bill. 1965, aside from all the civil rights things that were going on, is usually cited as the beginning of the Chicano movement. And the Chicano movement with the Chicano Renaissance, often it's called, brought a lot of writers to the forefront. And of course, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta with the farm workers' right. But the literature and the theater and the poetry and the novels and the printing presses, everything that was going on at the time makes 1965 a really key year. And then in 1994 with NAFTA, NAFTA created a different relationship with Mexico. And there was also an influx of people coming in the 80s from Central America and other countries. And of course, in the 2000s, we are living it. We know what it is. We know the way that our literature, our Latinx and Chicanx literature is changing and growing. We have many more writers, perhaps not as many as we should, out there publishing, and not just in private, self-published, independent presses, but with major New York presses as well. So the next thing is I want to focus at all this historical thing that I've given you, just kind of narrow it down and focus on creative nonfiction. A little bit of fiction before, nonfiction, just regular nonfiction too. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and the genres, the characteristics, and the major Chicana and Latina essays and memoirs. So for general nonfiction, just all of it, academic writing. So all of us do it all the time in academia. I would say even in public schools or in any educational setting, you have to write, and that's academic writing. Journalism is probably the most read of nonfiction. People read newspapers all the time. They read the magazines. That's all journalism. Lab reports, very few people, scientists read them. And then movie reviews, which appear everywhere. And nowadays, of course, with the internet and with blogs, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, you have other places to read book reviews and movie reviews, and then liner notes. I don't know about you, but I miss liner notes. And maybe some of you are old enough to remember when every LP, every long play had a big, the folder where it came in had all these liner notes, and I would love to read where the music came from, who was in it, what were they doing, the history. We don't get that now that we stream music from Spotify. But anyway, I miss liner notes. And then now we can focus on creative nonfiction. The definition that I'm using comes from different sources, but it's pretty much the one everybody agrees to. It has to be factual writing. That's a given. And the use of literary devices of narrative and or poetry, often both. So you use poetic devices in the narrative, in the prose, in the factual prose. And then there's subgenres of creative nonfiction. Probably the most known is biography, autobiography, memoir, diary, travel writing, food writing, literary journalism, chronicles, personal essay, testimonial, other hybridized essays as well. The personal essay is probably the one that your students in high school and even in college, that's the one that most of them get to write at some point or another. Now, in creative nonfiction and nonfiction in the Americas, I'm going to go back a little bit to what we were talking about, but now first in the US. And in the US, we began in the 17th century. Probably the most famous one is the narrative of captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson from 1682. And these captivity narratives were very popular because often they had some kind of spiritual reason for being, the salvation, at the end, everything is fine because there has been redemption. There's been this the gratitude to the divine for restoration into, quote, civilization. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, I remember reading that in high school. It's probably still used in a lot of classrooms, and others from that early part of our history who were writing about what was going on. That was nonfiction. And memoir. And I put Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, again, because it is on a lot of curricula in high schools and in first year college classrooms as well. So all of them have to do with factual narratives, and many of them use creative elements. Now, nonfiction in the other part of the Americas, not the US, we've already talked a little bit about Mexico, but it is really all over South America, Central and Caribbean America. And in many times, the histories, La Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España is one early history. And then letters, epistolary narratives that are true. They're collections of letters. Hernán Cortés, the one who was in Mexico, cartas de relación. And then the códices. I showed you an image of the códice. I'm going to show you one again. There are only 12 surviving pre-conquest códices. There are many others, not many, but some more after the conquest. And then we have biography and we have memoir. Those are the major kind of genres. And this is a page from the Codex Borgia from 1252 to 1521 is when it was created. It's 133 feet long and it's folded into like an accordion. And it is, the names of the codices are according to where they are. And so the Borgias got this one, it's in the Vatican. And there are many others, like I was saying earlier, I got to see some of them at that exhibit in Mexico City a few years ago. I want to point to the center. The symbol here is for motion, for movement, or yin. And then the four directions, the four gods of the four directions, each one a different color, very, very similar in content, in concept to Native American beliefs about the four directions and the colors. And just, I wish we had time to like do a lot more with this and talk about the codices as literature because the stories are amazing. So some of the subgenres that I'm going to talk about in terms of Chicana, mostly Chicana, maybe some Latina writers, is travel writing. For example, Stephanie Elizondo Gris, who's from Corpus Christi here in Texas, and who is a professor in North Carolina, has several books that you can check out in terms of travel writing. Nature writing, Barry Lopez, although he's not Latino, I like his work, and so I put him in there. Military history, and I'm not sure if Francisco Cantú would agree with me, but his book about being a Border Patrol agent, it's a autobiography, and he writes about it as if he had been in the military and that there was a war. That's my interpretation of it. And you might want to check it out. Testimonial, Rigoberta Menchú from Guatemala is probably the most known, the more famous of the testimoniantes, women usually who write a testimonial. The tradition of testimonial comes from Latin America. And it is about giving testimony, about telling your truth, usually told through an interlocutor. Somebody else writes it for you or interprets it for you. And we have many of those as well. And then autohistoria. Autohistoria is probably the youngest of these subgenres, if you will. It was coined by Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a Chicana writer, philosopher, novelist. Well, not novelist, because she never really published novels. It was mostly poetry, some children's books, and nonfiction, quite a bit about nonfiction. Ooh, the Lee Gutkin, this should have been on the next slide, because the next slide, it's not there. It's a definition from the Creative Nonfiction website. The Creative Nonfiction Journal publishes absolutely wonderful flash creative nonfiction as well as longer pieces. And Lee Gutkin is kind of the one who has led the charge in this in the United States. The characteristics. So what is creative nonfiction? First person narrative, absolutely. Sometimes you'll see something in second person or even third, but most are first person. They're factual in content, like I said earlier, and it tells a story. Now, not always using Freytag's pyramid. Oh, and I'm sorry, let me explain what I mean by that. If you're not familiar with the term, I forget because I'm in English. We use the term a lot. Freytag's pyramid is the one you recognize on plot development, the rising action, the climax, and the denouement. And that's Freytag's pyramid. Freytag happened to be the one who designed it or talked about it in terms of Aristotle's notion of narrative. So that's why it's called that. By the way, creative nonfiction is not bound by literary conventions of either fiction or nonfiction. It's creative, it's nonfiction. So I call it a hybrid genre perhaps. Perhaps it could be said to occupy a third space that is neither of those two, but something new. Definitely literary, but not quite fiction. definitely factual, but not straight nonfiction. So the pieces that you read for today that I sent links to are excellent examples of that, I think. The characteristics of creative nonfiction, now from a book called The Art of Fact. It's one of the few books that takes nonfiction, creative nonfiction, analyzes nonfiction with a literary scholarly lens, if you will. And it's from Barbara Lusenberry. And these are the four things that she says you absolutely must have for it to be creative nonfiction. And that is, it has to be a documentable subject matter. In other words, somebody has to have seen it or experienced it or lived it. It has to be documentable. There has to be some evidence. Second, it must involve exhaustive research. If you're going to write, you have to research it. And it has to have a scene. What she means by that is what I use in folklore is the cultural scene, time, the setting, time, place, what's going on, the context. It sets the scene. And it has to have literary prose style, which I said earlier uses the elements of literary fiction and poetry. And one of the grand dames, if you will, contemporary writers of creative nonfiction in my book is Reina Grande, whose memoir, The Distance Between Us, is fairly popular. Her more recent memoir called A Dream Called Home. The first one, The Distance Between Us, has also been published as a young adult book. You can find both public editions online. She's amazing. And it is about an undocumented child coming to the United States. First, her parents leave. She's in Mexico. And then she joins the parents. She doesn't come unaccompanied. She joins her father on the trip. But it's still a pretty harrowing story that unfortunately many children have lived and are living at this moment. The second one is how she, as a working class immigrant who had been undocumented, ends up at the University of California in Santa Cruz, studying creative writing. It's an amazing story. And by the way, for all of us who are teachers, it's also a very gratifying story because it was her teacher who kind of lends her a hand and makes her life as a writer a possibility. The other one you all know, Sandra Cisneros, and I'm not going to play the video here because it's fairly long, but I have it in here. I was going to play between 47 and 107. You can see it's still pretty long. It's her acceptance lecture, if you will. She just received this award in Chicago from the library. It's a Lifetime Achievement Award. And I thought I was going to play, but it's just too long, too much. But she does have a book that is not a novel, it's not poetry, it's a memoir. Although she says it's not a memoir, that's how it's being classified. It's called A House of My Own, Stories from My Life. And basically, I love the book. It has some wonderful scenes in it, absolutely poetic. It's Sandra Cisneros, so it has all those qualities of her brilliant fiction and poetry with detail and a special attention to metaphor. I mean, it's just brilliance. One of my favorite books right now, A House of My Own. I taught it a few years ago in Missouri, and my students loved it as well, especially those who want to write. And then Oscar Cáceres, whom some of you may know because he does projects here with Humanities Texas, and he has wonderful pieces in his website from essays that he has published. He has done several for Texas Monthly, in the New York Times, and he has because he is such a wonderful novelist, his creative nonfiction has the feel of it being fiction, and he brings all of those qualities into it, to the literary fiction. The other one is Irene Lara Silva, whose essay I sent you from Texas Highways. I love that piece. She has a subsequent one on wildflowers that I didn't put on there. Maybe I should have, because with spring here, it's just a wonderful piece. And Irene also has a blog, and just dip in there in the blog, and her writing is just exclusive. She's so just exquisite is the word I meant. She's just um, picks the right words and puts them in the right place in the right um, tone. The style is amazing. And Irene is a poet too, and you can see that the poetry seeps into her creative nonfiction. The contemporary venues where you can find creative nonfiction, Hablemos Escritoras. It's a podcast that I'm in. There's interviews with writers, mostly in Spanish because it's about Mexican writers and Spanish language writers in the US. So share that with people who are interested in that. And then Death, Sex, and Money. It's one of my favorite podcasts. Um, just Anna Sale is the person who does it. It's what it is. It's about death, sex, and money. But then she has themes. And recently she's been doing some older things about older people as well. And then the blogs. And I try to be diverse in the blogs that I chose. So I looked for blogs from different parts of the country. And this is what I found. And it's from New Mexico, Michelle Otero, from Minnesota, Anika Fajardo, Tennessee, Shuli Coward. She's Latina, Mexican woman, although her name is Coward. And then La Bloga. Now, La Bloga is a site for reviews and interviews. And you will be able to learn about all these different writers. And especially when a new book comes out, many of us just go to La Bloga to find out more about it. It's really amazing. Um, and then, oh, and the website. I already told you about Oscar's, his website.